Eric stormed up to his room, still annoyed at his mom. He wasn't really angry at her since he knew that she wasn't trying to be mean or anything, but he was still very annoyed that she didn't understand him and made no effort to. Once again she'd nagged him about helping out more around the house. What annoyed Eric was that he spent all day at school, then had to do homework when he got home. That didn't leave him any time to spend with his friends or to just go out having fun. Sure, Eric knew that his mom worked too, but she worked at home, sending her work in by computer. She only had to go into her office once a week or so, which left her at home all day where she could get things done. At least, Eric thought, she was able to stay home where it was comfortable, and it wasn't like it took much effort to clean the house up. Eric didn't mind helping out a bit, but it annoyed him when his mom kept nagging him and expecting him to do more than his share. As Eric slammed the door behind him to his room and tossed himself onto his bed, he said, "Man, I could use a vacation." At the moment he was thinking about how his mom had gone on vacation a couple weeks earlier, leaving him and his sister Sunny with a neighbor. When she'd come back, she looked a lot better. Almost as if she were years younger. Eric was sure that he could use a vacation himself. A vacation from his mom's nagging. At 14, Eric knew that he was too old to be nagged by his mom. Especially since he knew that cleaning the house and all that stuff was his mom's job anyway. And at 7 years old, his sister Sunny wasn't much help either. Eric couldn't help but envying the way that Sunny didn't get nagged about doing chores, being free to do her own thing. Trying to calm himself down and get the latest argument out of his mind, Eric reluctantly pulled his homework out and started work on it. Sighing, he said again, "I could definitely use a vacation." That night, Wendy finished cleaning up the kitchen and walked into the living room, drying her still wet hands with a towel. Stopping, she saw that her children Eric and Sunny were watching some movie on TV. Sighing, she couldn't help but being upset still about that argument she had earlier with Eric. Wendy knew that she shouldn't let it bother her, but Eric's earlier accusations that she didn't understand him hit a little too close to home. It actually made her feel a little guilty. Had she really forgotten what it was like to be that age? Of course she knew that Eric certainly didn't understand just how hard it was for her either. It wasn't as easy as he seemed to think to get her work done and sent in, while at the same time cleaning up the house. She wished that just for once he'd have a little appreciation for all that she did. Wendy looked over at Eric sitting on the couch with Sunny again, and frowned. He probably didn't even remember their argument, and if he did he sure wasn't showing any signs of it. She envied the ability of kids that age to put their problems out of their mind. It certainly would make life easier, she thought. Still worrying about her stressed relationship with her son, Wendy finally noticed what they were watching on TV. Watching the screen for several minutes, Wendy started to get an idea. As a smile formed on her face, Wendy finally came to a decision. Silently chuckling to herself, Wendy left the room, plans still forming in her mind. When her alarm went off, Wendy stretched and got out of bed. Squinting, she saw that it was 4 a.m., just like she set it for. Perfect. Yawning, she tried to ignore how tired she still felt, knowing that she could go back to bed in just a few minutes. After slipping her robe on, she quietly started digging into her dresser drawer, pulling something out a moment later. In her hand, Wendy held an old amulet with the image of an angel or fairy engraved upon it. Smiling, she remembered how she'd been lucky enough to find it several weeks ago when she was on vacation. And how much luckier she had been to discover its powers. Wendy fondly rubbed her finger over the engraving, thinking about how she'd used it to make herself several years younger after she'd found it. Smiling mischievously to herself, she thought about the other use she had planned for it that night. Quietly she walked to Eric's bedroom and slowly opened the door. Peeking her head in, Wendy made sure that Eric was asleep before going the rest of the way in. Stopping at the edge of Eric's bed, Wendy smiled down at her sleeping son. Hesitating for a moment, she thought that maybe she was going a little too far, but shook her head and once again reminded herself why she was doing this. It seemed so appropriate to do it that night as well. Since Friday was just starting, it was the perfect time. After all, it had been the movie Freaky Friday that had given her the idea. Wendy carefully slipped the amulet around Eric's head, feeling nervous as she did so, afraid that he'd wake up. After she'd done that, she touched the corner of her bathrobe to the amulet, then just as carefully removed the amulet. Relieved that her son hadn't woken up yet, Wendy slipped the amulet over her own head. After hesitating for a second, she picked up his dirty shirt from the floor and touched it to the medallion, feeling a slight tingle when she did so. Fighting back the strong temptation to stay and watch the changes, Wendy slipped out of Eric's room and back to her own. As she was hiding the amulet, Wendy couldn't help but questioning if she did the right thing, feeling suddenly very nervous. However, she knew that it was too late for second thoughts now. Sighing, she pulled off her robe and watched as her body slowly changed. As her chest started to go flat and her hair started to pull up and grow shorter. Wendy was amazed as a penis slowly grew between her legs, unsure of having such an unfamiliar organ. Once the changes had finished, Wendy looked at herself in a mirror, seeing the image of her son Eric reflected back at her. Yawning again, Wendy reset her clock and crawled back into bed. Ignoring the temptation to explore the changes in her body, she let herself drift back to sleep. It was going to be a very strange day, and she knew that she'd need all the sleep she could get beforehand to handle it. Eric woke up to his alarm going off, telling him that it was time to get up for school. Groaning, he rolled over and hit the sleep button, wanting to wait a few minutes more before getting out of bed. However, as he rolled over, something did not feel right. His underwear were extremely uncomfortable, pulling too tight on his hips and butt. He could also feel some weight on his chest when he rolled over. Sitting up in bed, he felt the weight on his chest even more. Looking down, he was faced with a pair of very female breasts pushing out from his own chest. Gasping in shock, Eric was surprised to hear his gasp sounding odd as well. Horrified, he reached a hand down between his legs, finding that his crotch was smooth, lacking the usual objects that belonged there. Eric jumped out of bed and almost fell over from his new and unfamiliar balance. Holding his breasts in his hands, he gulped, staring in shock and confusion. He wondered what the hell was happening, when the door suddenly opened. Eric stared at the door with his mouth open since the person that walked in looked just like him. What the hell? Eric manages to gasp out, surprised at hearing the feminine voice coming from his mouth. Somehow, he realized that it was familiar sounding, but he couldn't quite place it. The other Eric walked in, with what he recognized as his mom's bathrobe wrapped around him in a bad fit. The other Eric smiled and said, "Good morning, Eric." Eric gasped, then stuttered, "Who are you? What's happened to me?" The other Eric frowned slightly, then looked down. "It's me, your mom," Eric gasped. "I don't know what happened," she said quietly. "I just woke up like this, and came in here to check on you." Eric was dazed, especially by the next comment. "You've turned into me." Horrified, Eric stared at his hands, seeing the somewhat long fingernails. Gasping, he pushed past his mom, running as fast as he could to the bathroom with his new balance. Eric winced as his breasts bounced around and jiggled, hating the uncomfortable feel of it. In the bathroom, he stopped and stared in the mirror, seeing his mom reflected back at him. Waving his hand back and forth, he saw the reflection do the same. It was real. That was him in the mirror. Eric couldn't believe it. It just wasn't possible. Turning away, he saw that his mom was standing there watching him. How could this happen? Eric asked frantically. How? His mom smiled faintly and responded, "I don't know, but..." She gestured at Eric, "I'd prefer it if you got dressed." Eric blushed, suddenly feeling embarrassed. "But..." He tried to argue, wanting to point out that they need to find out how to change back, but his mom silenced him and led him to her bedroom. Not knowing what else to do, Eric went along. When his mom gestured for him to sit down, Eric nervously sat on the edge of her bed, horribly confused by what was going on. But his mom's calmness helped him stay stable himself, kept him from panicking. Then she turned and faced him, saying, "We're going to have to pretend to be each other for the day. I'll have to go to school as you and you'll have to stay home." Eric nodded numbly, while his mom tossed some clothes onto the bed. "You can wear these." I'll need to get dressed in your clothes. With that, she started to leave the room, then stopped and added, you'll need to take a shower first, of course, and so will I. Then she walked out, leaving Eric to himself. Eric just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands and trying to ignore the strange feelings he was getting from his body. He could hear the shower running in the other bathroom as his mom washed up, but didn't feel quite like facing himself that much just yet. Instead, he got up and grabbed his mom's other bathrobe from her closet, putting that on instead. Though Eric wasn't quite ready to shower in that body, he realized that he should cover up to help hide his new body from himself if nothing else. Nervously, Eric sat back down on the bed, trying to come to some kind of terms with what had happened. Every time he squeezed his legs together and felt nothing in between, or every time he gently pushed into one of his breasts, he could only think it's not possible. Suddenly Eric remembered watching Freaky Friday the night before and had a suddenly sinking feeling in his gut. Feeling horrified, he remembered that he'd thought it would be kind of cool to have something like that happen. That it would be interesting. He'd actually wished to himself that something like that would happen to him, knowing that it never would. That it was impossible, so harmless. Gulping, Eric felt a wave of guilt wash over him. Somehow, he was sure that he caused this. That he was the one responsible. My God! Eric muttered to himself. He'd never really wanted to become his mom, or a woman specifically. He just thought it would be cool to suddenly have a person turn into one of their own parents. If he could turn into one of his parents. This wasn't what he wanted. Or was it? Eric couldn't help but wondering if maybe he really had wanted something like that, somewhere in the back of his mind. If maybe he was wishing for it a lot harder than he'd thought. Eric couldn't believe that he had caused this. But what other explanation was there? Forcing himself to calm down, Eric reminded himself that if this was just like the movie, it should be only for one day. If he muttered, scared at that one word. Some time later, Wendy pushed the door open and walked in, already dressed in Eric's school clothes. He couldn't help but staring at her, amazed at how much she looked like him, and how easily she was accepting this. She seemed to shrug a little when she noticed that Eric hadn't done anything about getting washed. Shrugging, she told Eric, let's go get something to eat. Eric nodded and got up, walking to the kitchen with his mom. He sat down and watched her pour a cup of coffee and a bowl of cereal. She hesitated for a moment, then slid the coffee over to Eric, saying jokingly, here, Mom. Then she started eating the cereal herself. Sighing, Eric took a drink of the coffee, wincing a little at the strong bitter taste. It didn't taste bad at all. Just a little different than he was used to. Slowly, he kept sipping at it. Staring at the cup in his hands, Eric debated whether or not to tell his mom what he suspected, then decided that it could wait. He wasn't even sure that he was the one responsible, and eased his rising guilt and fear by promising himself that if they didn't change back soon, that he'd tell her. Looking at his mom eating cereal in his body, he couldn't help but notice how easily she was accepting this. How well she was taking it all. Somehow, Eric knew that she shouldn't be. That something was odd with that as well as with everything else. He decided though that she was just putting on a good show for him. Trying to keep him from being more afraid than he was. What surprised Eric was that it was working. He wasn't quite as afraid or panicked as he might otherwise be. Eric took his time drinking the coffee, watching his mom finishing her bowl of cereal. Neither of them said anything until after Wendy had finished the cereal, then pushed the bowl to the side. After she sighed, she looked at Eric and said, I said earlier that we'd have to pretend to be each other, and we will. I'll have to go to school for you, and since I'm doing that, you'll have to stay home as me. Eric winced, not liking that idea. That includes doing all the house cleaning, she added with a smirk. But we've got to find out how to change back, Eric protested. Wendy slowly responded, I know, but for some reason, I have a strong feeling that we'll both be back to normal by tomorrow morning. Eric started at her, unsure. Let's take advantage of this while we can, and see what each other's lives are like. Eric thought about it for a few minutes, then reluctantly said all right. But we still don't know if we will change back. What if we don't? He started to get nervous again. I'm sure it will be all right, Wendy said, trying to calm her son down. She felt a bit guilty for deceiving him, but thought that she couldn't help it. Smiling, she joked, at least you get to stay home from school. Eric groaned in response. Looking at the clock, Wendy stood up, saying, I guess I'll have to go now to catch the bus to school. Eric gasped at that. She just smiled, adding, you'll have to take care of everything here. That includes getting Sunny off to school as well as cleaning the house and making dinner. Eric stared at her in surprise. Still stunned, Eric watched his mom get up and walk towards his room, only to come back a moment later with his book bag in her hand. She smiled at him, saying, wish me luck, then she smirked, adding, Mom. Chuckling to herself at that, she finished with, good luck to you too. I'm sure that you'll handle things here just fine. With that, she walked out the front door, leaving Eric all alone. After staring at the door his mom had just left through for a minute, trying to get a grasp on what had just happened, Eric said, shit. Eric sat where he was, finishing off his coffee and trying to decide what he needed to do. Every several minutes, he'd push a finger into one of his breasts to remind himself that it wasn't just a dream, that he really had turned into his mom. Finally, Eric realized that he couldn't just sit there all day, saying how impossible it was. Since his mom had said they were to act as each other for the day, he'd have to do all the housework. Eric winced at that, then asked himself how difficult could it be? First though, he knew that he'd have to get showered and dressed. Not to mention getting his sister up and ready for school as well. Fortunately, her school didn't start as early as his, which would give him a little time to get that taken care of. Realizing what he needed to do, Eric got up and headed towards Sunny's room. After Eric gently shook his 7-year-old sister awake, she rolled over and opened her eyes, yawning. Morning, Mommy, she said cheerfully, then sat up. Morning, sunshine. Eric responded, using the same nickname that his mom always used for her. Since he was going to have to pretend to be his mom, he knew that he'd have to act as much like her as he could so as not to make Sunny suspicious. Ready to go to school? He asked Sunny while she climbed out of bed, dressed only in her pink pajamas. Sunny nodded, then ran to the kitchen ahead of Eric. Sighing, he followed a bit more slowly. Once in the kitchen, Eric poured his excited sister a bowl of cereal, setting it down in front of her. Then he took the bowl his mom had left on the table and put it in the sink, wishing that she would have cleaned up after herself. At least he always put his dirty dishes in the sink instead of just leaving them lying around. Looking over and seeing Sunny digging into her cereal, Eric couldn't help but smiling. She looked so cute. For some reason, he felt a little more protective and caring of his sister than normal, and wondered if it had anything to do with his being in their mom's body. After deciding that it was, and that he shouldn't worry about it, Eric poured himself another cup of coffee and sat down with her. Taking a deep sip, he realized that it seemed to be tasting better to him. Maybe I'm developing a taste for it, Eric silently told himself. Eric tried to ignore the inane chatter from Sunny as she finished her cereal and ran back into her bedroom. Sighing, he put her dirty cereal bowl into the sink and cleaned up the spilled milk and cereal from where she'd been at the table. He couldn't help but wondering if anyone other than him ever cleaned up after themselves. Going into Sunny's room, Eric found that she was already getting dressed. He let her do it on her own, then right after she was finished, took a brush and started running it through her long hair, trying to straighten out the snarls and snags in it without hurting her too much. As Eric held the blonde hair between his fingers, he couldn't help but sadly remember that Sunny got her hair coloring from their dad, while he had his mom's auburn hair. Trying to put the memories of his late father out of his mind, Eric focused instead on putting Sunny's hair into a ponytail for school. There, finished, he said to his sister cheerfully, thankful that she at least took her baths at nights so that he didn't have that hassle to deal with. For a little while afterwards, Eric pretended to be their mom, while Sunny talked nonstop. He wondered absently how their mom could stand it without going insane. It was already getting rather annoying to him. It took all of Eric's patience to stay in character, though it did get a little easier for him. Finally, Eric saw that it was about time for Sunny's school bus to come by. With great relief, he gave her the quick-bagged lunch he'd made and ushered her out the front door, saying, "Have a good day at school, honey." Calling her honey had just slipped out without Eric even realizing it. "Finally," he said, glad to at last get his first moment of peace and quiet since he'd woken Sunny up. Since he no longer had Sunny or his mom to distract him, Eric was forced to confront his new body. Nervously, he looked down, seeing the obvious bulges from his chest. Now that Sunny wasn't around, he felt unsure of what to do next, so sat down on the couch. He couldn't help but notice again how big his butt felt to him. As if he had a cushion built in. As Eric absently touched the robe he was still wearing, he realized that he no longer had any excuses. He would have to shower and get dressed. He would have to do the thing that he'd been avoiding all morning. He'd have to face his new body. "I might as well get this over with," Eric muttered to himself as he started walking towards his mom's bedroom and private bathroom. Though he wasn't going to admit it, even to himself, Eric was starting to feel a little curious about his new body and wanted to examine it a little closer. Stepping into his mom's bedroom, he slipped the robe off, letting it fall to the floor while he sat down on the bed. Looking down, all Eric could really see was the breasts that were pushing out from his chest, blocking his view of lower down. When he bent forward, he was able to get a look at his crotch, gulping as he did so. Eric nervously touched the folds of skin around his vagina, surprised to realize just how sensitive it was. It felt so strange. Gently, Eric ran his fingers over his new genitals for several minutes, finding himself beginning to get aroused. He could feel his nipples hardening, and his crotch beginning to get wet under his fingers. Eric couldn't believe the feelings his new body was starting to generate. And as much as he would have liked to keep up exploring himself, a rising pressure in his bladder told him that he had other business to take care of. With some reluctance, he left his position on the bed to relieve himself on the toilet. After Eric had finished relieving himself, he was surprised, not at how odd it felt to pee like that, but at how comfortable it felt. Almost natural and normal. Not nearly as strange as he would have expected. Eric absently dried himself with some toilet paper, thinking that it felt like the right thing to do for some reason. Standing in front of the mirror, Eric smiled faintly at himself, thinking that he didn't really look as old as he would have expected. Normally when he saw his mom's face, he knew how old she really was even after her vacation when she'd started looking better. He knew that the reflection hadn't changed, but for some reason, he just couldn't think of it as looking old. Shrugging, he turned away from the mirror and climbed into the shower to start getting cleaned. Eric took his time showering, making sure to examine himself carefully while he was cleaning up. When he was finished, he dried himself off quickly, then started to put on the clothes his mom had set out for him earlier. He was extremely thankful that she had plenty of pants and didn't go in for those skirts and dresses. Eric was sure that he would have died of embarrassment if he'd been forced to wear something like that. Slipping the bra on was bad enough. Once his clothes were on, Eric looked at himself in the mirror again, and was immediately struck with how wrong the image looked. His hair looked horrible, and he knew that his mom always wore a little bit of makeup. Sighing, he sat down and started brushing his own hair out, finding that it was somewhat relaxing to do so. After that was finished, Eric thought that he looked better. He was tempted to try on the makeup, but knew that he'd probably make a mess out of it. Just as he was about to get up, he had second thoughts, remembering that his mom said he'd have to really pretend to be her. And she always wore makeup. After debating with himself for a few seconds, Eric thought what the hell and carefully started to put on makeup. It took him several tries to get it right since he kept putting it on a little too heavily, and his mom always wore only a little bit. Finally, he was satisfied with the light makeup job that he'd done. Staring at his reflection yet again, Eric had a feeling that something was still missing. Eric said to himself, realizing just what it was. He wasn't wearing any earrings or jewelry like his mom normally did. Eric shrugged to himself, saying, "I might as well do this all the way," then put on some earrings that his mom normally wore. After a brief hesitation, he slipped a delicate watch around his wrist, and a slender necklace over his head. That should do it, Eric mused to himself, satisfied at the reflected image. Satisfied that he looked decent, though Eric wasn't quite sure why that seemed so important to him considering his current situation, he started walking towards the living room. He still had other things he needed to take care of. Though Eric didn't like it, he knew that at the moment he didn't have much other choice. He would have to clean up the house and do all of his mom's normal housework. How difficult can it be? He asked himself. Eric started off by washing the dishes left behind from the previous night and breakfast. He knew that his mom would often leave them to do after dinner, but Eric decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it right. His pride wouldn't let him do it any other way. Especially not when his mom would probably nag him later on if he didn't do his best. And Eric didn't want that. Instead, he was going to show her that he could do her job even better than her if he wanted to. With that in mind, Eric finished up the dishes and started to vacuum the house from top to bottom, giving it a thorough cleaning. It took him some time, but he wanted to do as thorough a job as he could. As he cleaned, Eric was finding it easier and easier to ignore his new breasts and other changes. He barely noticed though as he got more comfortable in his new body. The one time he did briefly notice, he decided that he was just getting used to it, then quickly went back to work. After Eric had finished vacuuming the whole house, he threw the dirty laundry into the washer and took a quick break and cup of coffee before he went to work cleaning the bathroom. Eric spent the rest of the day cleaning everything in the house he could think of, only taking several breaks. It was more difficult than he would have thought, though it wasn't really too bad. And he couldn't help but feeling proud at how nice a job he'd done. He couldn't remember the entire house having ever looked so spotlessly clean. Once Eric had finally finished with everything, he was feeling just a little tired. Looking at the clock, he saw that he still had a little while until Sunny would be home from school. And not too much longer after that until his mom would be back. Taking another break, Eric stretched out on the couch, barely noticing the strangeness of his body anymore. Flipping the TV on, he saw that some soap opera was on. Eric shrugged and kept watching it though he normally wouldn't bother. But for some reason, he actually found himself getting into it. When it was over, he felt a little embarrassed that he'd not only watched a soap, but liked it as well. Sighing, Eric looked at the clock again, remembering that he'd still have to cook dinner. That was something he certainly wasn't looking forward to. Though he'd cooked several times before, mostly just helping his mom, he still knew that he wasn't a very good cook. However, this time he didn't have much choice, and thought that he was going to be damned before he just gave up. He was going to do the best he could and was going to show his mom just what he was capable of. Eric found a couple of cookbooks in the kitchen, and dug through them until he found something that he was not only sure that he could make, but had the ingredients for as well. Satisfied that it should work, Eric started work preparing dinner. Sunny came barging through the door just a little while later, even more hyper and excited than that morning. "Good afternoon, sunshine," Eric greeted her. "How was school today?" "It was fun, Mommy," the excited little girl said, giving Eric a quick hug before running back to her room. Eric sighed, wondering what it would be like to have that kind of energy. He quickly forced that thought out of his mind, not wanting to wake up the next morning as his sister. His current situation was bad enough and that would be even worse. Eric looked from the direction his sister had run, then back to the half-prepared meal, reminding himself that he still had to finish up. Shrugging, Eric went back to work, knowing that his mom would be back in a short time, and he wanted to have everything finished by then. By the time his mom got home, Eric had finished the dinner and was quite proud with the results. As she walked in the door, Eric couldn't help but chuckle to himself at the look on her face. He smiled to himself rather amused, having forgotten all about today being the day he was supposed to have taken tests in 3 of his classes, and given a speech in another. He almost felt sorry for his mom. Almost. Something wrong? Eric couldn't help but asking her, chuckling more at the grimace she gave him. "Thanks a lot," she snarled back sarcastically. "You could have at least warned me." Eric was about to respond, but Sunny came walking into the room. Smiling at her, he slipped back into the role he was playing, gesturing for both of his children to sit down at the table so that they could start eating dinner. Throughout dinner, Sunny kept chattering nearly non-stop, which almost amused Eric by this time. His mom started at her food and was eating rather slowly. Eric suspected that she was still upset about having a bad day at school and his success with dinner. Eric remembered how she usually kept pestering him about his day at school, so decided that this was the perfect chance to turn the tables. Smiling, he turned to her and started asking her how her day went, feeling curious about what he'd have to go back to, if he could go back, that was. He really hoped that she hadn't messed things up for him too bad, especially now that he was thinking of everything that she could have done to inadvertently embarrass him. Eric was at least pleased that she was as uncomfortable with that line of questioning as he usually was, and with Sunny there, she was forced to stay in her role as well. That, however, got to annoy Eric a little since she was pulling some of his own tricks as well, and not answering very clearly. After dinner, Sunny and his mom got up and left the table, leaving Eric to stare at all the dishes covering the table. Eric looked at them in disgust, thinking about how much work he'd have to put into cleaning them when he did all the cooking. Sighing, Eric started cleaning the table, thinking that it wasn't something he hadn't already spent all day doing. Once the table was cleaned of dishes, Eric was startled to see his mom come walking in with a surprised look on her face. "My God," she said, "what did you do to the house? I can't believe how clean it is." Eric chuckled at her reaction, then put his hands on his hips and, using his best imitation of his mom's nagging voice, said, "Well, since I spent all day scrubbing the house down and cooking dinner, the least you could do would be to do the dishes." He almost burst into laughter at the look on his mom's face. And then Sunny came in, curious as to what was going on, so his mom couldn't say anything back, which Eric thought was even funnier. "All right, MOM," she said sarcastically, glaring at Eric. Then as she walked past him she whispered so that Sunny couldn't hear, "I'll get you for this." Eric chuckled and left the kitchen to his mom. Walking past his mom and his body, he was glad that they had been real close to the same height. He didn't think he would have liked getting a lot shorter like some of his friends' moms. Not at all. Still chuckling to himself over his slight victory, Eric sat down in the living room. Noticing that either Sunny or his mom had put their dirty shoes on the coffee table, Eric felt annoyed. Groaning to himself, Eric started to clean up the mess left behind, wondering what kind of slobs he was living with. And after all the work he'd done that day cleaning up too. All the ceaseless work that Eric had put into cleaning all day was finally beginning to take its toll on Eric. Beginning to feel tired, he sat down on the couch to rest a little. Eric couldn't believe that he was getting tired this early in the day. Yawning a little, he clicked on the TV, seeing that the news was on. Normally he wouldn't bother with the news, but since it was the only thing, he left it. After a few minutes, he found himself beginning to get interested in it, much like he had earlier with the soap opera. After Eric had been relaxing for a while, getting caught up in the news, he was feeling much better. During a commercial, he listened and could hear his mom in the kitchen doing the dishes. That brought a smile to his face. Then he glanced around, realizing that he didn't know where Sunny was at. Feeling a little curious, and vaguely worried for some reason, Eric got up and went to her room to look for her. When she wasn't there, he was getting a little more worried. Until he saw the door to his mom's room open when he knew that he'd closed it. Smiling, Eric got a good idea where she was. Eric peeked into his mom's room to see Sunny crouched down looking into the bottom drawer of the dresser. "What are you doing?" he asked her, trying to sound authoritative. Sunny looked up, embarrassed at having been caught. "I'm sorry, Mommy," she said, looking afraid. "I just wanted to look." Eric smiled faintly at her. "That's all right. You shouldn't go looking in other people's rooms like that though. It's rude." Sunny apologized again, looking greatly relieved at having gotten off so easily. She held something out to Eric in her hand. "I found this in your drawer," Sunny said, sounding a little embarrassed. "Can I play with it?" Eric looked and saw that it was some sort of cheap necklace. It looked like cheap costume jewelry. "Please," Sunny pleaded. Eric shrugged, not seeing what harm it could do. "All right," he smiled at her, "you can play with it for a while." Sunny smiled and hugged Eric, holding the necklace still in her hand. Then she ran out of the room, slipping it over her neck. Eric chuckled, thinking how cute she was. Wendy finished putting the last of the dishes away. She was glad to finally be finished, though she could still hardly believe that Eric had done that to her. dumping all those dishes on her when he was supposed to do them. Sure, she knew that she often told him to do them, but it wasn't the same. And it was especially bad after the day she just had at school. It was horrible. All those kids made her feel claustrophobic, the teachers made her feel dumb, and she had all of Eric's tests and things to do, when she didn't even know the material. Still, even though she was annoyed at Eric, she couldn't help but admitting how good a job he'd done around the house. Absolutely everything had been done. Everything was spotless. She knew it must have taken him a lot of work, but she couldn't imagine her son doing that. He was always avoiding stuff like that. Sighing, she was forced to admit that he'd done a better job with cleaning than she'd imagined. And a much better job cooking. She couldn't imagine how he could have cooked such a good meal on his first time. I can't wait to get back to normal, Wendy muttered to herself, already thinking about getting hold of the medallion. Reluctantly though, she remembered that she still had to do Eric's homework. Wait, she suddenly realized, it's Friday. Eric can finish it this weekend himself. With that decided, Wendy left the kitchen, vaguely feeling guilty because she always made Eric do his homework on Friday while it was still fresh. Looking again at the spotlessly clean floor, she realized that Eric had been able to do her job pretty well. The guilt rose again, making her think that she wouldn't be doing her part. She wouldn't really be carrying on with Eric's life for the day. Changing her mind about the homework, Wendy started to head to Eric's room, thinking that the sooner she started, the sooner she could get done. And the sooner I can get back to normal, she reminded herself. Eric smiled as he watched Sunny and his mom sitting next to each other on the couch. They looked so cute together. He couldn't help but look at his mom, thinking how young she looked. That thought suddenly hit him as he realized that she did look like just a kid. He knew that was his face though, and was sure he wasn't a kid. But from his current perspective, he could swear that his old face looked so young. Eric tried to put that out of his mind, not quite liking where that thought was leading him. Sitting down in his mom's usual chair, Eric absently crossed his legs in what felt like a perfectly normal position, not noticing that it was the same position his mom used. That he was crossing his legs like a woman. Looking over, he noticed that his mom seemed to be pretty caught up in whatever was on TV. After watching for a few minutes, he noticed that it was Jurassic Park, one of his favorite movies. What was odd was that she usually didn't like that movie and avoided it. Shrugging, Eric started watching it, though it didn't seem nearly as interesting as normal. After a while, Eric looked at the clock and realized that it was Sunny's bedtime. Better get ready for bed, sunshine, he told her gently, noticing that she was looking very tired, and trying unsuccessfully to hold back a yawn. But mommy, she protested, Eric gets to stay up. Eric smiled at that familiar argument, seeing that his mom was as well. That's because he's older than you, honey, Eric gently told her, seeing the pout on her face. Yeah, squirt. Eric heard his mom say, which surprised him since he was usually the one that teased Sunny, and his mom who told him not to. Because I'm older. Sunny stuck her tongue out at their mom, thinking it was him, then slowly went into the bathroom where she would brush her teeth. After several minutes, Eric went in after her to make sure that she had brushed her teeth. Seeing that she had, Eric led her to her bedroom where he helped her get dressed in her pajamas. He was amused to see that she was still wearing that cheap necklace from earlier. Eric smiled at her, thinking how cute she looked. While looking at her, he felt something odd. He was feeling some kind of affection for his sister. Sort of protective for some reason. He couldn't help but wondering nervously if that was maternal instinct or something. Eric pushed that thought out of his mind, then bent over and gave Sunny a quick kiss on the cheek. Why don't you go hug your brother goodnight, Eric suggested to her. Sunny nodded, then ran out of her bedroom to go give her brother a hug. A moment later she was back. Why don't you let me have that back? Eric said, gesturing at her necklace. Reluctantly she handed it over and he took it with a smile. Sunny crawled into bed and Eric pulled her covers over her, then gave her a quick kiss goodnight. Good night, sunshine, he said gently as he turned off the light. After closing Sunny's door, Eric looked at the necklace in his hand and chuckled. It did look rather cheap. He wondered where his mom had gotten the thing from. Shrugging, he put it on top of his mom's dresser, then went back into the living room with her to finish watching the movie. Only a few minutes later, Eric glanced at his mom, seeing that something didn't look right. If he didn't know better, he'd almost think that she'd shrunk a little. He tried to put that thought out of his mind but couldn't. When he looked again, he was sure that she was smaller. His clothes were looking a little baggy on her. Not only that, but her hair looked a little longer and lighter colored as well. Eric stared at her for several more minutes, noticing all the changes. "What the hell's happening to you?" he asked his mom finally. "What?" she responded, turning away from the TV. She seemed surprised to hear her own voice, which didn't sound quite like Eric's anymore. Then she noticed her loose clothes and gasped in shock. Eric watched her examine herself frantically, then look up at him. "The medallion," she gasped out, by this time looking a lot smaller and no longer like a teenage boy. "Where's the medallion?" With that, she jumped up and ran into her room, tripping over her now baggy pants. Eric followed behind her, seeing that she dug into the bottom drawer of her dresser. "It's gone," she said nervously. Then she looked up at Eric with a little fear in her eyes, saying, "Sunny." Eric gasped, suddenly realizing that his mom did look a lot like Sunny now. She was changing into his sister. Eric stared at her in shock, then noticed which drawer she'd run to. He remembered how easily she'd reacted that morning to the change. "You did it," he gasped at her. "You changed us." "Why?" She suddenly looked embarrassed and had to look up at Eric. Eric scowled at her, realizing that the strange necklace Sunny had found in his mom's drawer had done this. It must have. That was what his mom was looking for, and Sunny just had. "Well," he demanded, wanting to know. "Later," she said, sounding a little frightened. "I have to get the necklace back from Sunny." "No," Eric said firmly, grabbing her now tiny arm. Now she stared at Eric, seeing the look of angry determination on his face. "I want you to tell me everything now." Eric felt guilty about bullying his mom like that, but he had to know what she'd done and why. She'd as much as said they'd be back to normal in the morning, which meant she could control it. He needed to know how. She pulled at her arm to no effect until Eric let go. By this time she looked just like Sunny, wearing Eric's now much too large clothes. Tears were forming in his mom's eyes and Eric felt bad about frightening her, but he had to know. "All right," she said quietly. "I found a necklace while I was on vacation. And it has magic powers and can change people." Eric nodded, having seen the effects of it himself. "I made myself a little younger, and just kept the necklace hidden since I couldn't do much more without attracting notice." Eric nodded again, thinking that made sense. She wiped a tear from her eye, and Eric felt bad for her. Without realizing it, he bent over and gave her a hug. She hugged him back as if needing the comfort. Sighing, Eric let her go and gently told her to go on. She smiled nervously, no longer looking quite afraid. Then she said, "When we had that argument, I thought you might be right." She hesitated for a moment. "I didn't know what your life was like. But you didn't know what it was like for me either. When I saw you and Sunny watching Freaky Friday on TV, I just thought that if we traded places like that, we could understand each other better." Standing up again, Eric frowned down at the little girl. "And why then did you lie to me?" He felt angry that she'd done that without telling him, without asking him. And then she'd left him afraid and not knowing if they'd change back or not. "I'm sorry," she said, tears coming from her cheeks again. "How does it work?" he asked her, wondering if he should use it to change everyone back to normal right away. She told him that it takes 12 hours to change again, which Eric didn't like. It meant his mom was stuck like that, which on second thought, he decided might actually be a good thing. It would teach her a lesson about messing with other people's lives. She also told him that a person needs to touch clothes to the necklace while wearing it to change themselves. She wasn't sure why she changed if Sunny was wearing the thing. Suddenly feeling nervous, Eric went and peeked into Sunny's room, seeing that not only was she already asleep, but looking like him in her bed. "Oh boy," he muttered, wondering just how he was going to explain that to Sunny when she woke up in the morning. Careful not to wake Sunny, Eric pulled a pair of her spare pajamas out of her dresser, went out and handed them to his mom. "These should fit better," he said. She accepted them thankfully and started putting them on. After she was dressed, Eric said, "Now little girl, you're too young to be up so late." "I'm your mother," she protested. "You can't treat me like this." Eric scowled, then put his hands on his hips. "From where I'm standing," he told her, "I'm the mommy, and you're the little girl." She gasped and looked at him in horror. "You can't be serious," Eric frowned. "Very serious. You wanted me to be the mom for the day, well now I am. And a mom's job is to make sure her young daughter gets to bed on time." Eric smiled to himself. He didn't really like bullying her, but he wanted to get his point across. "Now you can go to my room and sleep on my bed." "I'm sleeping in my room," she snapped at Eric. Without a word, Eric grabbed her and started spanking her. She started crying from the humiliation and had tears coming from her eyes. Eric let her go and asked, "Will you be a good girl and do what mommy says?" She started to glare at Eric but was warned not to by the look in his eyes. "Yes," she said reluctantly. "Yes, what?" "Yes, mommy," she said quietly, knowing that she was defeated. Without any further arguments, she went to Eric's room and crawled into his bed, which was now huge to her. Eric smiled at her gently, feeling sorry that he'd hit her, but still being furious at what she'd done to him. Sighing, Eric gave her a hug, then pulled the covers over her. "Good night, sunshine," he said, then gave her a kiss on the cheek before turning off the lights and leaving the room. Not wanting his mom to be able to try any stunts that night, Eric hid the necklace in a place that a 7-year-old girl wouldn't be able to reach. He had thought about using it to change himself back to normal, but as long as Sunny and his mom were stuck as they were, someone would need to be the mom around the house, and that job fell to him. Besides, Eric didn't feel uncomfortable anymore and thought that he could handle another night just fine. Eric stayed up for a little while longer, then went to bed himself. In the morning, Eric got up and quickly showered and dressed. Once he was presentable, he went in and checked on his mom, seeing that she was still asleep. Smiling to himself, he went and checked on Sunny. Reluctantly, he woke her up and calmed her down from her shock at her new body. Eric explained what had happened to her a little, then gave her some of his clothes to get dressed in. She seemed excited to suddenly be a giant from her point of view. He chuckled at how she ran around the house examining everything from her new point of view. Once his mom was up, she wasn't nearly as enthusiastic. Especially not when Sunny took advantage of her new size to bully her around a little. Through most of the morning, the little girl and teenage boy were taking turns talking excitedly, or fighting. All of which was getting on Eric's nerves. Once he was sure that the 12 hours was up, he used the necklace on Sunny. Right after she started shrinking down, Eric took the necklace from around her neck, noticing the look of disappointment on her face. Just then, his mom, still looking like Sunny, came in. "Change me back now," she said excitedly. Eric just smiled and said Sunny always said she wanted a sister, much to his mom's horror. With that, he walked away to hide the necklace. Eric figured that he could change his mom back either late Sunday or Monday before school. Until then, he reluctantly decided to remain as the mommy to keep things under control. She was furious at that, which Eric thought was appropriate after the way she changed and left him. For the rest of the day, Eric had a pair of 7-year-old girls running around the house playing dolls and tag. He was amused to see how easily his mom had fallen into a child's actions. She was talking like a little girl and playing just like one. And since she was Sunny's clone, he couldn't always tell them apart except by their clothes. Still, Eric thought that it was rather interesting to have two little girls running around the house and a lot quieter than when one of them was a teenage boy. He couldn't help but wondering if he and Sunny had been that annoying to their mom at times, and suspected that they were. The next day was pretty much the same. Eric had to keep an eye on the little girls who were caught up in their playing all day long. He even caught both of them watching some show that Sunny liked, and was surprised to see his mom cheering along with it, just as excited as Sunny was. Shaking his head, he couldn't help but wondering how much that necklace changed a person's mind and how much was just a normal adapting to the situation and body. He didn't know, but he thought that he'd have to find out sometime. At Sunday night, just before Eric was going to send the girls to bed, he realized that he had school the next day and that he and his mom would have to change back. He smiled vaguely, thinking that he would miss being an adult. He'd also gotten kind of used to his mom's body and wasn't sure how he'd be able to handle going back to normal. Still, he was looking forward to getting back to normal as well, thinking that he could get away from the house cleaning and babysitting. Those responsibilities could get rather tiring after a while, he decided. Once Eric had retrieved the necklace, he went to look for his mom so that he could change her back first. When he heard one of the girls in the bathroom, he went into the living room where he found the other. "Sunny?" he asked, not quite sure since they both looked and even acted identically. She giggled slightly, answering no. "I'm Mommy." Eric winced, thinking just how much her mind seemed to have regressed. He'd noticed that a lot over the last couple days. Eric carefully put the necklace around her neck. "Let's get you back to normal, okay?" She nodded, then ran off towards her room. Eric smiled as came back a moment later, obviously a little bit taller. It was working. She smiled at Eric and he waited to take the necklace so that he could change back as well. "Just a moment," she said, then ran out the front door, leaving Eric a little confused. She came back with a smirk on her face. Just then the other Sunny, the real one, came into the room. Eric smiled at her, then looked at the one who was now several inches taller than her former clone. "Where's the necklace?" he asked, wanting to get back to normal. She smirked back, and Eric looked down at Sunny, who was staring at his mom in horror. Then his mom answered, "I tossed it into the back of a truck that was driving by." Eric gasped, and so did Sunny. "Oh my God!" Sunny cried out, and Eric looked at her. "You didn't?" The not quite so little girl smirked and crossed her arms. I liked being a boy and didn't want to change back. Now I'm going to be the big brother." And she looked smugly at Sunny. "You get to stay the little girl." Eric gasped, suddenly realizing that he'd changed the wrong one back. He'd given the necklace to Sunny, not to his mom. And not only that, he also recognized his own features beginning to form on her face. She had used it to turn herself into him, then gotten rid of the necklace. "My God!" Eric gasped, looking at his mom in horror, then at the real Sunny who was looking down at herself smugly. Eric asked her what the truck looked like, but she shrugged and didn't answer. Both Eric and his mom, the new Sunny, questioned her, finally finding out that it was a red truck, but nothing else. They both stared at each other in horror, realizing that the odds of finding a single red truck were almost impossible. The new Sunny fell to the ground crying, and Eric hugged her, knowing that she'd need his strength and comfort. He had to stay calm for her sake. "How can I do your job?" Eric asked the new Sunny. "I can do all the housework, but I don't know your real job." She shrugged, then promised to show him what to do. Eric sighed, knowing that he'd have to take advantage of her offer while he could, since he wasn't sure just how much longer she'd even be able to remember. Reluctantly, he knew that he could figure it out with her help, and even if he couldn't really do her job, he would be able to find another one somewhere that he could do. Sadly, Eric looked at his new daughter and his new son, knowing that this wasn't going to be easy for him. The new Eric would have some real troubles in school, she knew. And then there was everything else. Shaking her head, the new Wendy knew that she'd probably never find that necklace again, but that wouldn't stop her from looking. But even if she did find it, she still had a life to live until then, and a family to take care of. She ignored the new Eric glaring at her, knowing that he was angry at being grounded for a very long time. Wendy picked up the TV guide, looking to see if there was some show on that could take her mind off of her new responsibilities for a little while. After seeing what was on that night, she winced. "No way," she said emphatically, shaking her head in disgust. "I hate Freaky Friday.